Thanks everyone again for joining us for the Mass Medic Town Hall. This is Town Hall number 8. I would have to say I'm incredibly enjoying these over the past few weeks with you all. So really do appreciate all the support and really just thank you. You guys have been an amazing community to chat with every week. So I think it's helped keeping us all a little bit sane, hopefully not fully sane, but at least a little bit sane during all of the craziness. So like I said, we do have a really great lineup for today. We'll be talking with representatives from JJDC, Covington and Berlin, and American Cancer Society Cancer Action Network. So what we wanted to do was bring together a couple of really important topics on fundraising, understanding the Emergency Use Authorization. So we've had a lot of questions come in from members about whether they should be applying for this, what's the opportunity, kind of what are the ramifications, and what does the process really look like. I don't know if any of you have actually looked at the documentation online, but it's somewhat clear as mud, as usual. So I'm glad to have Christina on the line to kind of walk us through that. And we asked Shalini from American Cancer Network to come and chat with us about what the impact has been on folks who need continuous treatment, right? So this has been an incredibly hard time for hospital systems across the community, obviously, but around the world as well. And we really wanted to understand the impact this is having on those who regularly come into clinics, hospitals, medical situations to get treatment, what this has meant for them, and maybe where the opportunities are, right? As we start to explore the innovation and things that come out of this, what are those opportunities that we can be looking for to improve the status quo? So as usual, try to keep yourself muted if you're not asking a question, just so we eliminate background noise. But if you do have a question, they are highly encouraged. Please feel free to pop them into the chat bot, so you can type your question in there, or there is a raise hand section at the bottom. If you have any comments or questions, you can either choose to raise your hand and we'll call on you in real time, or pop them into the chat bot and we'll make sure our speakers have your questions. So Brian, did you have anything you wanted to update us on this morning, or should we jump right into content?
I did want to say, first off, thank you to you, Rachel, for all your hard work in booking speakers and for helping to organize this. I think, this looks effortless, but there's a ton of work that goes involved in getting 2 to 3 speakers every week. So kudos to you, and thank you to everybody who has joined us to share their insight. I wanted to also, if you have not seen our presentation last week, where we had researchers from the Needle on at BU, I would really recommend you watch that. It was one of the best overviews of the actual COVID virus that I've seen. We have all these available on demand to view. So if you go look at our COVID-19 resource page on Mass Medic, you'll find it. And then I also just wanted to highlight that it is National Nurses Week, and what an incredible debt we owe to all of our frontline healthcare workers, but in particular nurses. We don't often, I don't think we spend enough time talking about what an incredible job nurses do. They're there when we're born. They're with us the whole way through the course of our lives. They do the hard work. This has been a very challenging time for them. I have a brother who's a nurse down in Hartford, and he was an orthopedic nurse just 7 weeks ago, and his ward was converted to comfort measures only, and then to escape that, he was assigned to a COVID unit as well. So these nurses across all walks of life are being asked to do incredible acts of not just heroism, but incredible acts of empathy and comfort, and are being pushed to do things that maybe they haven't fully sort of had to do since school. And I just think every week should be National Nurses Week, but this one we're here to salute them. And I just wanted to make sure that we all, if you have a nurse in your life, I wanted to thank them. If you've been a nurse, thank you. And I just think we should make sure that we salute those folks, the men and women there doing that work.
Absolutely, Brian, thanks for sharing that. And just to build on that for one quick moment, a lot of the local hospitals and health associations have put together kind of mental preparedness and training for their frontline workers. A lot of that programming is available through the websites and online. I recently saw an article by the Boston Globe on what some of the local hospitals are doing to try to mentally help sustain and fortify frontline workers. We do have a psychiatrist who's responsible for putting together the program for MGH on our women's event tomorrow at 10 a.m. speaking about mental health. So if you or anyone would be interested in participating and attending that program, it is free of charge. It's open for men, women, medical, non-medical, healthcare, non-healthcare workers. But I know those programs have been, put in place for frontline workers because they are experiencing things, as Brian said, that I think many of them could never have imagined or even started to mentally prepare for, and they're doing an excellent job. So as we salute them, please feel free to take moments for yourself as well and for others around you. So that was just a little note for that. So I think this is a great point to turn things over to Kadir. If you want to take the lead, we'd love to hear about the state of investment from Johnson & Johnson's perspective and see any tips that you may have for people on the line.
Okay, great. Thanks, Rachel and Brian and Rachel. Thanks for the invite. Can you hear me okay?
We can.
Okay, yeah. So, I was just kind of scrolling through the great attendee list, and some of the names actually I can recognize. So thanks for doing this at these times, because sometimes when you're all by ourselves, we kind of try to fill the things with the dread and the fear of news, and talking to kind of fellow people in the community definitely helps. So I appreciate again for the invite. So to introduce myself again, I'm Kadhiresan. I'm with part of JJDC, Johnson & Johnson Development Corp. For people not familiar with JJDC, it is the venture capital arm of J&J, Johnson & Johnson. We make investments, equity, other type of investments in all three sectors: pharmaceutical, medical devices, and consumer. And I'm part of the medical device group, and I'm based in Boston, in Cambridge. It's been a while since I've been to the office. I hope everything is well. I kind of miss it being in there, but like everyone else. And I focus on investments mostly in the US. I do have a colleague based on the West Coast. He takes care of the West Coast investments, and I do the rest of the US. As mentioned earlier, we are part of J&J. We are strategic investors, so meaning we invest in entities that have a strategic alignment with any of the J&J operating companies. On on some stats here, and these are publicly known numbers. On a yearly basis, we make anywhere between $400 to $500 million in investments. That is across all three sectors. We make about maybe perhaps 30 to 40 new investments in a given year. And approximately 35% of that tends to be in medical devices. As I said, we are set up like a VC firm. We kind of meet every 2 weeks to review investments and look at the strategic nature of it, and obviously the financial aspects of it before we make an investment. I'll go after the first question, which, and when Brian and I talked, I think it was last week, on what's on everyone's mind. What is happening with investments in this climate, right? So I can tell you that things that we did start off, I think, starting off diligence and so on, those things are still ongoing. Last week we closed on, at least that was a follow-on investment, and the week before that we did another investment that was kind of closed as well. And I should mention that the one investment that we closed, we did have a new investor, and this is an investor based in China, that came in and closed an investment. This closed April 15th. Although I should say some of the diligence has kind of started a little bit before that. So things that have kind of been in the works that are ongoing. In fact, there is one investment that we are kind of considering that I'm not leading, but one of my MedTech investors are leading, is maybe that will be the first investment that we have done everything by Zoom, for example. That is possible. The only thing that I see some pause is as we look at some of our co-investors, potentially new syndicate members coming in. There could potentially be a pause here where, I'm not sure where COVID is leading, so I'm going to kind of hold off. But the investments where JJDC is taking the lead and working only with insiders, we are able to kind of proceed on those and hopefully kind of close on some of those, even perhaps, meeting all virtually. As we all know, how we're going to get things done and going forward might be very different from what we used to do, right? We are getting more comfortable with virtual kind of approach to companies. Um, with respect to BD, M&A, I'm not able to kind of represent that. I mean, if you talk to people in the M&A group within J&J, at least medical devices, I'm hearing that, things that have been in the works are still ongoing. What's been added is that during this COVID type of situation, there could be some kind of a new type of opportunities that might come by, right? I mean, things that we are looking at, some of the telehealth. I'm not saying telehealth has become suddenly a focus for us, but things of that nature sometimes can be opportunities that we have not looked at, could become interesting these days. So I mean, there are several things that I can kind of go over, but if there are some specific topics, I don't know, Rachel, I don't know whether if you're getting some questions, or Brian,
Sure.
if you have some questions, we can go over.
Yeah, I'm happy to lead a little some Q&A here, because I think, and I would like people to chime in on the chat bot too, and we will be happy to ask your question as well. So when we look at investment currently, and we look at it within the lens of COVID, is COVID, in terms of the decision to invest or not, is COVID now kind of baked in as a headwind? Like, if COVID is going to impact your direct business model, sort of over the next, immediate time frame, 12 to 18 months, does that kind of put it on an immediate no for investors? Or, I know you have to look sort of on a 10-year event cycle, but how are you framing the risk from the pandemic in terms of
Yes.
baking your thinking?
Yeah. To the way we think about it is, I mean, obviously from a J&J point of view, we are in there for the long term, right? Things are, there is going to be continued healthcare needs. People are still have to kind of show up at hospitals, go get their knee joints replaced, get their, get a AF ablation. Those type of things will continue to happen. The question has always been is, at what point does it come back to whatever, we quote unquote normal is? I think COVID for us is more of a short-term thinking in terms of what is happening during these times. What is the delay in getting back to the hospitals? If you're going in part of a clinical trial, how much longer is going to get back to the clinical trial? That is how I see it in terms of what's going to happening. We all assume, and if that assumption is wrong, then we have to kind of go find different jobs here, is that at some point, is it Q3 or Q4 or early next year, things are coming back to where it was. Maybe the way we kind of get to those patients would be different. On the way, we may not have a normal patient clinic, for example, but procedures and things are still have to get done, and it'll be back to where it was. So the question for us is approaching the investment and saying, what are the short-term risks that you have, and what happens during this time? So, for example, one of the things that I always ask is, well, okay, so you finished enrollment, and are the follow-ups happening during this COVID time? So a CEO or someone should be prepared to say, okay, this is what happened prior to COVID, this is what happening during COVID. So I want to make sure I get an understanding that it's not a complete pause during this time, but there are still some things happening. So to me, I'm thinking this is a kind of a short term that we want to understand it more, but long term, we are betting that things are coming back to where it was.
So say you are a small company, or you are a company, a very early stage company. Let's even assume that you're sort of in the holding tank trying to raise a Series A. What do you do with the time that you have here? What's the best use of your time constructively, and what's sort of useless? I mean, does it make sense to spend, reallocate efforts, working on your investment deck? I mean, is it business model? I mean, what's the best thing that small companies that are currently kind of paused can do to increase their chances of funding when we do?
Yeah, no, I do feel for the predicament that companies are in. I think that the key thing, first of all, to make sure and then focus on your burn, right? I mean, make sure that you're going to live another day and focus on the cash burn. I mean, this is not news to most of the people on the phone here, but that is something you're going to be maniacally kind of focused towards to make sure that, yes, you're able to kind of stave off those things. If you have a board, make sure work with your board to make sure understand what's kind of going on here and how this kind of changes. One of the things that the silver lining, if you will, during this COVID situation where we all have travel restrictions, we are taking more phone calls, right? I mean, there is more. We are not the time that we are not spending on the plane. We are able to kind of like sometimes, even though this could be non-strategic for something like a J&J, I would love to know what's happening. So there is some time I have to kind of be engaging with companies. So I would say the companies should kind of engage their potential investors to keep things going rather than saying, well, let's see what happens after 2 months come September, I will give them a call. The bandwidth is available now, so I would say take care of, make use of it, and optimize and fine tune your investment thesis. Um, Although it is very tempting sometimes to say, well, how I could kind of be a diagnostic test for COVID type of thing. If you really are, God bless you, you should kind of go after it. Don't try to kind of somehow tweak your business model to make it, oh yeah, this is related to COVID. I think that becomes very apparent if you're kind of stretch. So focus on the long term, and in the meantime, and also keep in touch with your KOLs and your investigators, because they have time too. It's amazing how many evening calls they are willing to take these days. So I would do that and say that you're being relevant, and so that when things kind of lift off, things will kind of come back.
So you talked about investing within the J&J portfolio, and the J&J portfolio is famously incredibly deep. I mean, I think there's only 2 letters of the alphabet that you guys don't have a brand or company. Uh, um, I would imagine you're seeing a lot of COVID-related products. Would that be a fair assumption?
Yes, I mean, so because of the pharmaceutical, I think the Janssen, I mean, obviously we are working on a vaccine, as you know. There are things that comes related to that we get to, and also in terms of diagnostics. I think we have one diagnostic company in our portfolio right now that has been repositioned. It's a point of care diagnostic that's been repositioned to address that. Although we are not directly in the diagnostic business, we understand that this is a different environment, so we are trying to kind of get there, especially trying to kind of get to a kind of a how you can complement something with a vaccine. With respect to devices, we are not seeing much, and we have not at least done any investment diligence in that space as of yet.
I was curious. So, leading indicators that folks in the investment world watch. How can you tell if a market is robust for a small company investment?
You're talking regardless of the COVID, right, Brian? Or
Yeah, yeah. I mean, just what kind of factors can we watch to determine the health of the market?
Well, I mean, there is the existing market and the new market, right? So the existing market, obviously, I mean, the procedures, right? So that is one key indicator that you can think about in terms of how are things kind of going. I mean, I should say before that, there is the unmet clinical need is always, things on. So what has been addressed, what has been done so far, and how are they working? And then, as you get comfortable with that and saying what portion of the market is it addressing? Because when we talk about unmet clinical need, I mean, we have a broad stroke. It's typically we say, oh, this is going to kind of address everything. But then, you go take a much closer look. It's much more nuanced look than that, right? I mean, things like, one example that I've followed is mitral regurgitation, like mitral valve repair, right? So there is probably room for many technologies, and each one is going to address a very specific portion of the functional mitral regurgitation market or the heart failure market. So there could be more than few things that can kind of go after this. So I think as we get comfortable with what technology for what part of the market, right? Doesn't have to be $1 billion, right? If you know, well, I can be sure of the 300 million patients or whatever it is that it can go after, then that becomes kind of a little bit interesting for us to say, well, we understand where this could be applied to, and we can kind of track it accordingly.
So we have a couple questions here, and they actually dovetail with a question I had sort of about J Labs. And first of all, we had folks and one person in our group wants to understand sort of the connection between J Labs and JJDC. How direct is that connection?
Well, I mean, they're all part of the J&J innovation umbrella. So J Labs is as you know, is a no strings attached model for where we are landlords, incubators that gets into the J Labs facilities. I mean, we have two, one in Lab Central, one in UMass Lowell, where there are J Labs facilities. And by getting access to those facilities, you're also getting access to some internal expertise within J&J, and perhaps periodic exposure to good educational content and so on. JJDC is as you know, it's all about investment, where you either if you're a JJDC portfolio company, you either have some kind of a convertible note or an equity investment or financial interest of fiduciary responsibility from J&J into those companies. Some JLabs companies are JJDC portfolio companies, and vice versa. So it's all part of the innovation umbrella, but it's different level of strategic touch and interest, if you will.
There's another question just about the atmosphere at the J Labs co-working spaces. Has COVID slowed down any of the research taking place there?
So the updates I get from J Labs, and the head of J Labs has them, that they have done a phenomenal job of trying to kind of keep it, open. And obviously, it's sticking to the local governing regulations and so on to make sure that if people want to come in, they are able to come in, and all the distancing protocols and the wipe downs and so on has been kind of happening. So there has been no slowdown, I should say, and I haven't heard directly from portfolio companies of these, but if they want to access the facility, they are able to. And also, we are still continuing to, and I'm on the JLab selection committee, for example. We meet every 2 weeks or so to review which companies we want to be able to put into the JLabs, for example. So that's still ongoing.
A couple more questions here. So you said you're on the selection committee, so you must do some sourcing from J Labs for JJDC, or
yeah. So I mean, as we kind of that is the intent, right? So this could be a little bit early for us. So we say, hey, you know what, this seems interesting. Maybe this should be in J Labs, and we should kind of closely kind of watch these guys. And then see how they kind of perform. And so they're probably in a proof of concept or early proof, or like a prototype, for example. And then when they get to preclinicals or clinical, it could become a kind of a pipeline feeder for us. So that's something that we normally kind of look into, and that is the reason why we hopefully have that type of feeder pool as well for our pipeline.
Yeah, I mean, what's the best way to get on your radar though for JJDC?
I mean, if you go to jjdc.com, I think there is a portal where you can contact me or contact the general resource number, and that will come to JJDC.
Okay. I know, does JJDC lead investments, or do you guys look for a lead and then jump in?
We lead a good portion of our investments, I should say. But we also kind of co-invest. I don't know what the split is, but we, unlike probably other corporate venture groups, we are the way we are set up. We are a separate C corp within J&J. We have a strict firewall between ourselves and our operating companies. So we take the lead. We take board seats, which is very unusual for a corporate, but that is how we have been set up in our 45 plus year old history. We've always taken an active role. So we lead, we invest, and we take board seats as well.
And there's a question about what percentage of equity will JJDC consider, under 20%, more?
Whatever it takes. I keep hearing the 20% rule, but that is, you work with enough lawyers to understand that 20% doesn't have to be a limit. So we have ways to kind of go above that, and there are ways to mitigate an accounting considerations. So we have made checks as small as $500,000 to as much as, I would say, $200+ million in a single company. That is sometimes when you do something like called PIPEs. Because we do invest in public companies. So I think the key thing for us to kind of make sure that the investment that we are able to leverage, invest, and then leverage from others is able to get the company to a point of where we could say, an onboarding or an acquisition licensing can be made possible. That is our key goal. And we want to make sure that what we can invest along with others, obviously, because obviously we cannot take 50% of a company, for example. That is kind of hard. But we want to be able to make sure there's enough money around the table to get the company to that point.
Right, and I've looked in your portfolio. I mean, you've invested in many very successful companies, not all of which have been acquired by J&J. But as we get you sort of wrap this segment up, I just wanted to, you invested in Inspire, Novocure, Spinal Modulation, Coherix, among many other companies that were successful. Is there anything common thread about the founding teams on those that you could share with us?
Well, yeah, I mean, you cannot emphasize enough about the care of the caliber of the management team here, right? So because some of those companies, if you kind of look through it, they may not even started off with that idea. So it was probably a little bit of a pivot as you kind of go through it. And each of those companies that you mentioned, and there are a few more, has had some challenges kind of getting there. I think that has been the key is a good technology in really capable hands. I will take that anytime versus a great technology versus less than capable hands. So I think that and some of them I'll give you one example. NeoTract is one, although we didn't acquire it. I mean, but things. It was an impasse. I think if you some of on the call here knows how FDA was maybe 5-6 years ago, it was a very different time then, and I think they had to kind of work through all of those challenges to make sure that there was a pathway with the FDA with respect to regulatory. And I can give you examples of each company having a little bit of a different type of challenge, but I think that is definitely one redeeming quality we always look for is a good management team and all of these things, and that has been kind of critical in all of those successful exits that we have had. And as we say, an exit to J&J is great. That's why we invest in, but it is possible that we are not going to block an exit to another strategic, right? So, and that is from a financial point of view, that's good too, although that's not the reason why we invest. But a lot of times that happens, and that's probably the best for the investors and for the management team.
Great. We are going to let you go, but there's one quick question I think we could probably answer here. Just any insight on J&J working and incorporating deep tech like augmented reality and VR in medical devices?
Actually, we do have an investment in augmented reality company. The name escapes me right now. It's a company in pain management, for example. And I've seen some good demos of, for example, doing physical rehab through augmented reality and virtual reality. I think that is something that we have always kind of looking into. I think the key for us to say, how does it connect to some of our existing businesses? There's one investment that we made was related to a neuroscience team within Janssen, for example, as they're looking at pain and other ways to kind of get to patients. And we have looked at some few investments, for example, alongside with Depew in terms of how can we make rehab better, for example, with these things. So we continue to kind of look at those type of opportunities, but the question is going to be how does it fit, and how do we kind of monetize that as well?
Great. I'm sorry. One last question for me.
No, that's fine. Keep going. Yeah.
And I'm killing our time. I'm sorry, guys. Does it matter what stage the company's at for JJDC? You said anywhere from very small to very large. I mean, is there a cutoff point where you won't invest?
Yeah, and so it depends on some of the operating companies as we kind of work with. The sweet spot seems to be some data in humans. That seems to be the sweet spot. So whether you call it Series B or Series C, whatever that is. But then there are on either side of it, I think things that are very closely aligned. For example, we made an investment in a biosurgery company that was a Series A, for example. We have an investment, actually, a local company here in Lexington that was Series A in orthopedics, it's a synthetic cartilage, for example. So there have been some exceptions to this rule as things get really aligned, where we think that we can have kind of an earlier onboarding, for example. Then we will probably go a little bit earlier. Things that we understand less about, we want to have at least the human data and maybe understand a little bit after that in terms of reimbursement or maybe clinicals before we would acquire them.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for your time. Thanks for sharing your insight.
Thank you. Good luck.
Thank you.
Bye
You
now.
too.
Yeah. Bye.
Rachel, take it away.
Awesome. Yeah, absolutely. So I think this is a great time to transition into Christina. Let's chat about emergency use authorizations, what you all have been seeing, and what kind of insights you can provide. Because I think this is something where people are just now starting to understand, okay, some companies have been approved. We have no idea what's been up. People have applied and have not been approved. You know, is this a good idea? Is it not a good idea? How long is it going to last? All of that. So if you could take it from here, I think that'd be great.
Sure. Thanks, Rachel. And hi, everyone. Just to start with sort of the first question you raised, which is when do you need an EUA or when should you go get an EUA? The emergency use authorization process allows FDA to basically approve or authorize an unapproved product or a new indication for an approved product. So you only need it where you would otherwise need, a 510K clearance or a PMA. In addition, for this particular public health crisis, FDA has issued a very large number of enforcement policies. They're product-specific enforcement policies that permit either modifications to an existing product or new products to enter the market without 510K clearance and without compliance with a number of other of the typical regulatory device requirements. So, it's always first, I would check the enforcement policies. It may be that FDA has just, as a matter of enforcement discretion, waived the 510K requirement, and then you don't need an EUA at all. You can just go to market under the enforcement policies. If you want to have a product that would need clearance, it doesn't under the enforcement policy, then you're in the EUA world. And I do have, Rachel, a couple slides that might be worth just
Fantastic.
posting.
Yeah, you can share screen right at the bottom. But I may ask a really quick question based on what
Sure.
you just said. Have you seen any products that were not? So what I've been seeing from the things that are public are products that were already approved for something and are now being approved for different uses. I haven't seen anything that didn't already have some kind of clearance getting approved. Have you seen or heard about any products like that?
You mean under the EUA process?
Correct. So products that didn't have FDA or 510K approval beforehand, the only ones I've seen so far are products that were approved for something that are now given different uses?
Yeah, I mean, certainly all the diagnostic tests, right, that have gotten an EUA are brand new, and none of them existed before.
Okay. Anything
There are
outside of
EUAs
testing?
Sorry?
No, go ahead, sorry.
The EUAs there's an EUA now for these, what some people call intubation boxes, or what FDA calls like a barrier protection. And actually, let me just go to the slides, Rachel, because I have a slide on what are the EUAs. So let me know if you're seeing these.
Yep, absolutely.
Okay. So these are all the EUAs that have been authorized. This doesn't reflect the total number. These are just the categories. So for example, in the left, there's this sort of two types of diagnostic tests, but there are many, many, many individual EUAs that have been issued. The sort of middle box with face masks, face shields, again, like protective barrier enclosures. Those are these, for people who haven't heard of these, they're sort of clear boxes that go over a patient's head when you're doing like an intubation procedure or other airway management procedure. So it's sort of a clear plastic barrier between the patient and the doctor. That, as far as I'm aware, like never existed before this public health emergency. Those are actually, and most of those in that second column are what you might call umbrella EUAs. FDA issued them not for a specific company manufacturer. They're for the product category. If you meet the criteria in those EUAs, you're authorized under the EUA without any further notification to FDA. That's face masks. Oops. Sorry, I hit something. Face shields, the barrier enclosures, and the NIOSH approved respirators. The EUAs for other non-NIOSH approved respirators that are being imported, there is an administrative process. You have to provide some certain basic information, and then you'll be listed. The other ones here are for individual EUAs for individual companies. Again, with the exception, we go to the third column with the ventilators. So FDA, again, did a sort of umbrella EUA. They authorized ventilators. They set out the criteria under which you could be authorized. You do have to submit essentially sort of a EUA light to be added to the list of authorized ventilators, but there are 30 some now. And Rachel, to your initial question, I haven't actually gone through those recently to see how many of them are sort of a version of a previously cleared ventilator and how many of them are brand new. I think at least one of them, because there was press around this, was a ventilator that was sort of developed in conjunction with NASA. I assume that's a new design. So there are, I think, new products that are coming through this. And just to go back again to level set, where FDA's authority comes from, there's actually two things that needed to happen before FDA grants an individual EUA. Those have been both met here, but I think they're helpful to understand. So there has to be an HHS determination of a public health emergency. That was determined back in February. And HHS has to declare that the circumstances exist justifying emergency use. Again, that's been met here for devices. Originally, HHS just made the declaration just for diagnostics. Then they added a declaration just for personal protective equipment. But then they subsequently, at the end of March, made a declaration broadly for all medical devices. So FDA now has the authority to grant an EUA for COVID-19 for really any medical device. And then FDA has to review your individual EUA. And there are 4 criteria that FDA has to find are met for a particular product. And that's really what's going to drive sort of the content of the request. So it's basically that the agent that's the subject of the public health emergency, so the coronavirus, can cause a serious or life-threatening disease. That's met for anyone who's submitting an EUA for COVID-19. That the product may be effective in treating or preventing or diagnosing that disease. Again, that's a maybe effective standard, so it's a lower level than FDA might typically require, but they still do want fairly substantial performance data. Third, that the known and potential benefits outweigh the known and potential risks. So that again is where FDA is sort of requiring some level of safety and performance data. And then fourth, that there are no available approved alternatives. That doesn't mean literally no alternatives. Obviously, like in the diagnostic test space, in the ventilator space, there's, it's not like they have one EUA and then they can never do another EUA for the same product, but that available term is really, I think, the one that drives a lot of this to say, is there still a need for these types of products? So building on that, what do you actually need to submit in an EUA? FDA does have what they call this interactive template. It's sort of a Word document that has placeholders and the like. For some products they have, like ventilators, the agency has developed a product-specific one. For most other new products, there's just sort of a generic template. Some of the enforcement policies also do have some product-specific guidance on what FDA is looking at for an EUA. So that's worth checking. Generally, the contents are what's listed here. I think they're not surprising. Device description, the available data, a discussion of what alternatives, and the sort of public health need for your device, the risk-benefit discussion, again, going to that criteria that the benefits outweigh the risks. They do want some information on your manufacturing and quality controls. What we've seen FDA ask about is, are you compliant with QSR? If not, are you compliant with ISO 13485? If not, are you compliant with like ISO 9001 or some other quality standard? The agency can and has, for the most part, waived compliance with the quality system regulation when issuing EUAs, but they still want to understand, how are we going to be confident in the quality of the products that are entering the market under these EUAs? So what controls do you have in place? So even if you're, and I think, probably most of the people on this call, this is not as big of an issue, but it has come up quite a bit where you have companies partnering with non-traditional medical device companies to, increase supply or manufacturing capacity. And then your proposed labeling, your instructions for use, like you would on a typical submission, as well as fact sheets. FDA puts out these fact sheets that are sort of a specific artifact of being an EUA product, where you describe, what is an EUA, what's the scope of the authorization, some risks and benefits of the products. FDA has posted the fact sheets for all the products that have received an EUA, so you can take a look at those, but that would be something else you need to submit. The process is very informal, and that we've sort of, I think, seen a bit of a shift in the way FDA has been handling these over time. I do think we're in a bit of an inflection point with the EUA process right now, because we're a ways into this crisis now. At the beginning, it was very frenetic, and I think FDA wanted to be very much seen as responding very quickly, acting very quickly. So they were, diagnostic tests and things were being turned around in like 24 hours. And now that has subsided somewhat. There's, I think, 100 diagnostic tests that got an EUA. There's something like, I don't know what the count is, but 20, 30 ventilators that have been authorized. So there's just an absolute crush of a need has subsided. Same thing with PPE. I think they opened up the face mask policy and things like that. So that there's a little bit actually more structure to the process, but I think also less frenzy. You can do, and a lot of companies we've worked with have done this, some level of a pre-EUA interaction with the agency. This could be something as simple as, you have an informal email question, you want to make sure the right process or contact, or it can be really submitting essentially a draft EUA and having a call with the agency to discuss approach or the data requirements or what have you, more like, a very expedited pre-submission might look like. We have seen both, and the agency has been pretty responsive. Again, you just email, and generally we have been emailing sort of the relevant review division, the relevant OHT personnel, and then there's a couple general email inboxes that FDA has for EUA interactions. There's one on surgical masks, one on diagnostics, and a couple other ones. Submit the request. Again, it goes in by email. It's just like a PDF version of that template document I recommended. Again, we just have been submitting them to the relevant OHT review teams and then the generic emails. You will get like a confirmation email saying like we've received it, it's under review. And then there is some interactive review like you might expect for any other submission where the agency may have questions. We have seen some that just, there's none of that. You submit it and then they're just like, here it is. And other times where there's been some interactions. I mean, obviously the more you do are able to interact with the agency on the front end, maybe the less you have on that, the more novel your device, those kinds of things are going to drive how much interaction. The all important question that everyone wants to know is, how long is this going to take? It really depends. And again, I think we've seen a bit of a change in FDA's approach. It's going to depend, on how complicated and robust is your submission, the agency resources. So certain groups, if you're doing something that's not one of the traditional molecular or serology diagnostic tests, but would go to that same review team, I think you're going to have a hard time just getting the agency's time and resources. If you're a new type of device that is going to a review team that's not being crushed by these responses, you may get a much faster turnaround. And the agency is very much triaging these by sort of their view of the public health priority. What we have heard and seen is it's not a first come, first serve kind of queue. So they are looking at how much do they think is there a need for this product? And again, that's where I think we're seeing some sort of change in their views on things like diagnostics and ventilators and some of those other things where there's a bit more of an equilibrium now in meeting those needs. But not to say how interested are they in it, but just really what do they think the public health need is for that relative to the alternatives and what your product is. And then we talked about this already. The question, Rachel, you raised at the beginning also was sort of, what does it mean when I get an EUA? What are the implications of it? I mean, you're authorized to go to market, so it's like a clearance or approval for the duration of the public health emergency. FDA may waive things like quality systems compliance. We have not seen them in any enforcement policy or any EUA waive medical device reporting. That's something FDA really wants to make sure they're keeping safety reporting for all these products. Registration and listing is typically not applicable, but the agency may impose other distribution conditions, labeling conditions, and the like. So you're kind of subject to whatever is in your EUA. The question of how long this lasts and what happens at the end, it lasts as long as the declaration of the public health emergency lasts. If we go back to this very beginning concept, right, FDA's ability to issue an EUA is predicated on these declarations and the determination of public health emergency. So once HHS determines that the public health emergency no longer exists, then the EUAs are effectively terminated. We don't know when that is. I don't know when that is. So that's sort of TBD. Whether or not what happens to the products that entered the market during the public health emergency is a big open question. You certainly cannot continue to distribute or market products after the end of that. You would, to kind of continue to put your products in the market, you would need to get clearance or approval. But it's unclear what will happen to the products that were distributed, and for things like ventilators or other products that are not, consumed or have a short shelf life, there may need to be some disposition efforts. The statute, when it talks about termination, refers to things like, providing an appropriate time period for the disposition of the products. We have engaged with FDA on this. FDA is like, we don't know what we're going to do. They are understanding that there may be different considerations for products like patient monitors and ventilators that continue to be available and useful and may have applications outside of COVID patients, right? These are not products that are necessarily indicated specifically for COVID, the way a diagnostic test may no longer have applicability. So the agency may do something different in that case, but it could be that the agency says, products that were distributed under an EUA need to be, disposed of or recalled, or some other action needs to be taken, and that is a big question mark for us right now.
Yeah, I think that's amazing information. Thank you so much for sharing that. We do have a ton of questions coming in from the chat bot, which is great. So one question is, PMA products are covered under the preemption exemption for product liability, but 510Ks are not. Does the EUA contain any liability protection that you know of?
So not directly. There is a separate act called the PrEP Act, the Public Readiness Preparation Act, something like that, that is specifically about liability immunity in a public health emergency. There was a separate HHS declaration that basically triggered liability immunity under the PrEP Act for COVID-19. If you are an EUA authorized product, you can be a quote unquote covered countermeasure under the PrEP Act. So you would be eligible to be for the immunity protections, the liability protections under the PrEP Act if you are an EUA authorized product. There are additional requirements to fall under the PrEP Act. So to be covered, the declaration that was issued includes what we've been calling these distribution limitations. To be covered, you need to either be distributed in sort of conjunction with a federal agreement or grant or contract or purchase, or authorized as part of the sort of public health emergency response of an authority that has, of an agency or other governmental authority that has authority to respond to a public health emergency. It's kind of written circularly, but essentially you're authorized as part of the state or local or whatever response to the public health emergency. That can be like a letter or something saying, we're sort of authorizing you, or this is part of what we're considering a public health response, but you need to be something more than just under an EUA, but the EUA will sort of get you in the door to be eligible for liability immunity under the PrEP Act.
Okay, two more quick questions. Is an EUA required if you produce face shields and distribute them free of charge to healthcare workers?
No. Well, so there is already an EUA for face shields. There is also an enforcement policy for face shields.
Okay.
Whether or not you're doing free of charge or selling them is sort of immaterial to FDA. It's distribution. It needs to be compliant. You can, confusingly, the requirements are a little bit different under the enforcement policy and under the EUA, but both of them are viable pathways. You just need to look, they have things like labeling requirements on how you can and cannot label them. If you comply with either, you can go to market, you can be donated. If you comply with the face shield ones, you have the benefit being potentially, eligible for those PrEP Act liability immunity. But from an FDA perspective, either one is fine.
Okay. And you said 20 to 30 EUAs or ventilators have already been approved for an EUA?
Yeah, there's a list. I haven't looked at it recently, but it's like a couple pages.
Okay.
There's quite a big list that's really happened in the last couple weeks. So I think, like I said, the agency was really moving quickly and trying to work very collaboratively with people, and we have seen the agency happy to jump on calls, all those kinds of things. I think they still are, but the urgency is off, given I think the sort of sense that maybe there's less of a crushing need for additional ventilators.
One last question, and it may not be a quick answer, and maybe something that you need to mull over. As I look at some of these products in the device space, do you think there's any negative impact of a startup or a small company submitting for an emergency use authorization for something that's not a ventilator, or it's not a diagnostic test? If this is their first interaction with FDA and they don't get it, could there be a negative impact as they go back to try to interact with FDA for an actual 510K or PMA approval?
Yeah, I mean, that's sort of the same question we have with what's the impact of maybe submitting a pre-submission that wasn't as fully vetted as you would like it to be, right? Like, there's always theoretically the sort of human impact that you're interacting with people make impressions. Mm-hmm. And if you have a second interaction with them, that may be colored by their first impression of you. I certainly can't discount that. But I don't know that that's necessarily outweighs, like, if you have a product that you think can help in this public health emergency, submitting it and seeing what happens. I think, a denial, it doesn't necessarily mean FDA thinks you're, a bad company or it's a bad device. They may think there's just, alternatives that are sufficient, or it's too early. They, even though the data requirements are lower, they still want to see more data. So I wouldn't discourage people from submitting. I also think that human element may be less here, where there's just so many things coming in. The chances that FDA, it's the same reviewer down the line, and that FDA is going to really remember you seems less to me. But I certainly can't discount it, but I wouldn't let that override other reasons to submit.
Okay, thank you so much. That was a really great presentation. Really appreciate all of the information. And I'm sure people may have questions additionally. So everyone, feel free to pop them into the chat bot, and we'll make sure that Christina gets them. We'll make sure we share her slides with everyone so that you know how to contact. So really quickly, we have just one more update, and I apologize. I know we're probably going to run just like 2 minutes over, but Shalini from the American Cancer Society Cancer Action Network, I'd love for you to share with us just really quickly what's been going on with the network and how people can potentially get involved if they can.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Brian and Rachel, for this opportunity. I really appreciate it. I did have a few slides just to help give you guys an overview of the American Cancer Society and ACS CAN in terms of what's happening now. I'm just going to get that sorted. Okay. Are you seeing the slides?
No, not yet.
Oh, no, not yet. I don't know how to do this. Okay. Oh, I got it. Sorry, guys. You got it now?
Perfect. Yes.
All right, excellent. Let me get this back up. Well, first of all, it was just great to be with you guys and hear from Kadir and Christina, because I think a lot of the work that was highlighted just earlier in today's call actually ties into what we're doing at the Cancer Action Network. I know we're facing a major let me just see one thing. Is that, are you guys seeing the full slide?
No, we're seeing the notes version.
Okay. I don't know how to do this. Okay.
Okay.
It's all right. Okay. So let me see if I can do it this way. All right. So, you know, I think it's the first point I'd like to make is just really that while we're facing an unprecedented crisis right now, 1.8 million people in the United States will hear the words "you have cancer." We'll have 1.8 million new diagnoses. So last year, the American Cancer Society undertook a pretty extensive strategic planning process. And at the end of that process, what we found as our North Star moving forward is that by 2035, we want to reduce cancer mortality by 40%. And again, as I mentioned earlier, Kadir, Christina, all the work that everyone on this call is doing has to be done with the American Cancer Society to achieve this outcome and this goal. Where we are focused on is leading efforts in prevention and early detection, improving equitable access to care, and accelerating innovations to improve patient outcomes. It was really great to hear Kadir's conversations, because I think at the end of the day, the American Cancer Society wants the innovations that the medical device ecosystem, the biotechnology ecosystem is doing that will help us improve patient outcomes faster. We are doing this through research, cancer control, and advocacy. The pandemic has changed the way we are working. We still have our call center that's operating 24 hours, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. What we are hearing from our colleagues at the call center are that 70 to 80% of calls over the past 2 months have focused on questions and concerns around COVID-19. We have effectively gone to a full virtual workforce, and in an effort to continue to reduce costs, we are closing many of our offices. We have 34 Hope Lodges across the United States. These are home away from homes for cancer patients who have to travel far to get treatment. Right now, it is not safe to house immunocompromised cancer patients in these facilities. So we are working to repurpose these facilities to house COVID-19 frontline healthcare workers. I wanted to spend the last few minutes just talking about the American Cancer Society Cancer Action Network. That's where I sit. We are making cancer a top priority for elected officials at the federal, state, and local levels. We also work very closely with regulatory agencies. Christina talked at length about the FDA, CMS, etc. We are empowering cancer patients, families, and survivors to use their own voices to influence public policy. And we have a nationwide presence in all 50 states, Washington, D.C., Puerto Rico, and Guam. The COVID-19 pandemic has changed the how we work, but our advocacy work, I think, has doubled down and is as intense as I have ever seen it in my tenure at the American Cancer Society. This crisis has certainly highlighted that access to affordable, quality healthcare is as critical a need as ever. We have been very active in advocating during the last three stimulus packages. In these first three packages, we were really focused on improving public health systems, strengthening at-risk healthcare systems, as well as ensuring there's adequate funding for research and innovation. In this next stimulus package, we are really focused on cancer patients' access to care, as well as all of us that are impacted by the COVID pandemic. So we are advocating for policies such as ensuring equal coverage for oral and IV chemotherapy drugs, as well as advocating for a special enrollment period for uninsured or newly uninsured, underinsured Americans to get into health plans under the Affordable Care Act. We're also advocating for increased funding for those who lose, increased funding for Medicaid for people who lose employer-related health insurance. I know I'm going through a lot of items quickly, but I did want to just touch on that there are many opportunities to partner with the American Cancer Society and ACS CAN, and it'll come as no surprise to anyone on this call that this crisis is impacting not only our families, cancer patients, our economic livelihood, but it's also impacting our ability to actually implement our mission. There are several ways that you and your companies can be involved in the American Cancer Society at this time. And I wanted to highlight our corporate membership program at ACS CAN, which provides a venue for businesses and healthcare institutions to hear about our public policy priorities, but importantly, to also share what are some of the issues that you're seeing kind of in an immediate sense in terms of work you need to improve access to care or to strengthen innovation ecosystems. We also have our 13th annual ACS CAN Research Breakfast taking place September 24th. Because of COVID-19, we had to reschedule from mid-June. And finally, I just wanted you to know that we have a COVID-19 Hope Lodge response fund that companies can invest in to help us defray costs to house frontline healthcare workers. And that's it, Brian and Rachel. Happy to take a question or two.
Thank you. Yeah, that's fantastic. I mean, and MassMedic is a big supporter of the membership program as well as the research breakfast. I know it's something that we're looking forward to. I think it's great to kind of highlight the ways that people can contribute. And I know some of the conversations you and I had were really, I mean, what interests me is, right, the reimbursement opportunities and the reimbursement levels for oral drugs as opposed to IV, right? There's no reason that continuous treatment can't be happening outside of these venues, except for the reimbursement opportunity. So I really appreciate you all kind of spearheading that push and helping make sure that those who are uninsured or underinsured, right? I mean, I know it's happening and it's hitting all of us. So it really is important to kind of keep that work going as you look at the cost of healthcare. I know we've gone over on time, so if anyone has questions, feel free to pop them in the chat. But I think this is a great opportunity to say we're going to be sharing these slides with everyone who registered for the call today. So we'll make sure everyone has access to Shalini's information. And if you have questions, you can reach out individually. I think one more thing I did want to mention is we are not going to have a virtual town hall next week. We have another webinar that's happening at the same time, and we're going to give everyone kind of a break. So we'll send out the information and make sure everyone has the opportunity to attend the webinar. It's going to be a really important session, but we did want to let everyone know that we will be taking a break next week from the town hall and regroup in 2 weeks. Brian, did you have anything else to add?
No, I just wanted to thank everybody and reaffirm that supporting American Cancer Society is just so critical. There's not a person on this call whose life hasn't been affected one way by cancer or by someone who has had cancer. And if you have the means as a corporation, I would highly recommend still supporting this organization. Absolutely.
Thanks, everyone. We'll call it a day and look forward to chatting with you soon. If you're not signed up for the women's event tomorrow, 10 a.m., please join us. Mental Health Matters. You can find it on Eventbrite or our website, but it's going to be a really great session, just all about mental health. So I think it's really important. Thanks a lot. See everyone soon.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.